on and screen share. So here we go.
La plateforme de conception et fabrication d'antennes pour l'imagerie par résonance magnétique, IRM, vise à accroître la diversité des systèmes d'IRM par la conception d'amplificateurs de radiofréquences et d'antennes personnalisées pour obtenir plus de précision dans les images.
Je suis Nibardo Lopez-Rios, ingénieur en télécommunication avec un doctorat en génie électrique. Depuis plus de 25 ans, je travaille sur le développement de ce système radiofréquence pour l'IRM. Dans notre plateforme, j'ai construit plusieurs antennes en collaboration avec l'industrie et des institutions scientifiques. Elles sont utilisées avec succès dans diverses études, y compris des tissus vivants, des animaux de laboratoire et des humains. Actuellement, je travaille sur une antenne hybride qui vise à améliorer les études de la moelle épinière cervicale. Cette antenne a la particularité d'homogénéiser localement les champs magnétiques statiques pour réduire les artefacts tout en captant les signaux IR. Il s'agit d'un projet de collaboration avec le Martino Center qui est situé au Massachusetts General Hospital et qui est affilié à Harvard Medical School et au MIT.
Un système d'imagerie par résonance magnétique, IRM, nécessite des antennes pour transmettre et recevoir le signal radiofréquence. Le laboratoire RF aide à concevoir et fabriquer des antennes IRM sur mesure qui maximisent le rapport signal-bruit. Nos clients sont les groupes de recherche comme l'Institut universitaire de gériatrie et l'Institut de cardiologie de Montréal, les laboratoires animaux et les cliniciens qui ont des besoins particuliers de personnalisation des antennes IRM lorsque les antennes commerciales ne répondent pas aux besoins. Vous pouvez rejoindre Nibardo à la plateforme de conception et fabrication d'antennes IRM à Polytechnique Montréal.
Okay, so you can interact with Nibardo and his colleague Alexandru in the chat if you have any questions about the platform services. So after this short intro, I will pass the mic to my scientific colleague, Professor Leener, who will facilitate the conference and introduce our keynote speakers. After he presents himself, his ongoing projects in our ecosystem. So, Benjamin?
Yes. So thank you for the introduction. It's always good to see what we do at TransMedTech Institute. So I think we have some people that are not mute, and so we can hear some other people. Please mute your mic. Thank you. So I'm really happy to host this conference with Annie and the TransMedTech Institute on a topic that is really I'm really fond of and looking into neuroimaging, but accessibility neuroimaging, and that can cover a lot of different topics. I'm going to show you a little bit of what we do in my lab, introduce a little bit of the topics that we're going to talk about, and then I'll pass the mic to my colleague Stéphanie Noble and the team of Shannon Kolind to continue the presentation. Let me start with sharing my screen. Are we good? I don't know what you see. So good for the presentation. Perfect.
Good.
Okay, so yeah, perfect, thank you. So let me start with what we all hear about, looking into neuroimaging. What is neuroimaging? We try to look into the brain, but when we try to look into the brain, we may have some issues into accessing some scanners that are really high tech, or maybe some populations that can be difficult to reach when we try to look into the brain of people. And so this conference is really about the accessibility. How do we improve accessibility? How do we make sure that we make neuroimaging accessible for patients, for clinicians, for researchers? It's all about that. I'm going to focus a little bit more on children because I'm at the CHU Sainte-Justine, which is a children's hospital, and that's what I'm really fond of. And let me start with a quote. That works, yeah. My quote is for today: children see magic because they look for it. You know, I think there is a parallel to make with researchers. You know, we try to see magic, and then we try to understand what is the magic and how we can master it. You know, to transfer that magic into well, in this case, children, making neuroimaging feasible for them, because it has a lot of challenges. You know, I don't know if any of you has. I guess a lot of you have seen a scanner, but I don't know if a lot of you have been into an MRI scanner, but it can look a little bit scary. You know, I have a picture of a scanner, the 70 scanner that we have at the MNI at McGill University, that we can actually see through the door, which is relatively unique in these MRI rooms these days. It looks clean, but next to the door, you can see there the word danger. You know, the danger. There is a lot of signs. There is actually a fire extinguisher just next to the door. You know, it can be scary. So when you ask a child to go into the room and say, "Well, you're going to go into that little hole," and then ideally you would not move either for like half an hour. That would be great, so we can get really nice images of your brain, and then that's going to be super great. You can see them afterwards. Well, usually they are afraid, and the first thing they do is they want to get out, and so it's really difficult to get them to the scanner in the first place. Not in terms of accessibility, like time in the machine. I don't even start with that, but even having the machine there and a child into the machine, that's already a challenge. So we try to make rooms more interesting for them. So here's an example of a room for pediatric imaging, pediatric MRI. That's an example of the UCSF, which is a really nice room in that case, with a story built around it. Since the idea is basically to have the children accept more easily to be into the scanner. They have a movie inside that tells the story that is that has been presented to them before entering the scanner. So it's all about building their confidence into getting into the scanner and try them to accept to stay in it while not moving for quite some time. You know, so it's really nice, but you know, either they're afraid or they can be excited. And usually when they go into the scanner, the first thing they do is they start to move, and then we can try to get some good images. And here's an example of an image that we can get from a child of 1 day old. So it's really young child compared to an adult. The proportion are not exactly the same, but that's about that. So you can see that the brain here is much smaller than the brain of an adult. Here it's a really nice image because we can see the structures, but you can see also that the brain is not exactly the same. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But just looking at these images, you can see a lot of differences, even if a brain is a brain. But having an image like that, that's tricky. That's 1 day old child that is sleeping, so that's nice. Usually we can get these kind of things. You know, a child 2 days old here, that's what's moving, and so we get these images. So there is a lot of things that we need to improve. Even when we have the possibility to put them into the scanner, we have a lot of things to improve to get usable images, and so making neuroimaging actually accessible for them to use it in clinics. So that's what I'm going to focus about in my lab for the next long few years, looking into how to improve MR acquisition, because we have to accelerate the images. We have to make the images faster to acquire. We have to think about motion, how we can compensate for that. We have also to develop image analysis tools that are dedicated to this population specifically, because neuroimaging has always been about usually adults in research. It's young adults that we use for developing new techniques, and then we apply that to different populations. But then how do you transfer these developments into specific populations like children? That's tricky. And I'm going to talk a little bit about templates, for example, just as an example of what we can do. Let me show you some interesting results that my team has been working on in the past few years. We have Erjan here that has been working on trying to characterize the neuronal microstructure in preterm babies, so babies that were born preterm, looking at advanced diffusion MR modeling. So here we have advanced, even modeling like MR techniques that are not necessarily in clinics right now. We try to model the brain architecture in a way that is more powerful than what exists now, but we still have to understand how these techniques are working currently. So it's really a challenge of acquiring good data, trying to improve the acquisition, and Erjan has been working on that quite a lot to have this working. These are really beautiful images that we can acquire on preterm babies, trying to acquire images that are really nice quality, high quality, and then building all the processing tools that can be applied to these images. And that's really a challenge because the brain of a preterm baby is not exactly the same as an adult one. So a lot of work has to be done to making all the tools that are available in the community work on specific population. And that's what we talk about here in accessibility. We do kind of the same thing with the work that Noe and Daniel has been working on in the lab, looking at quantitative susceptibility mapping. So that's a measure that aims at being quantitative. So having a value that means something. For example, we can extract from these susceptibility maps the oxygenation in the tissues. So that's really relevant for babies, for example, that got lack of oxygen during birth, for example. When we acquire good quality data in different patients, but we apply different techniques to reconstruct these images, what we get are different results. And so we have difficulties even in the reconstruction and the analysis of the images once we get good quality data. And so taking into account the variability in the reconstruction techniques and understanding what's happening in these techniques for these specific populations that are not exactly the same as adults, the population that was made for initially. Well, that's a challenge. And Noe Daniel has just been accepted for a conference paper on this. And that's, I'm really happy to see that because it moves the field forward in neonatal imaging. Talking a little bit about spinal cord MRI, because we have always been focused about the brain. The spinal cord is also a structure that is important in the body, I think. It has many challenges. As you can see, it's a small structure. When you move the head, well, the structure moves, not like the brain that is quite static, but the curvature of the spinal cord moves. So there is a lot of challenges when you try to image the brain, but there is a lot of potential as well. Spinal cord structure is much simpler than the brain, so maybe we're gonna have stronger biomarker when we try to develop them to understand what's happening in the brain and spinal cords following an injury or testing new drugs, you know. So spinal cord MRI is great. We need to go into it, but it's quite difficult because nobody was doing it. Not a lot of people were doing it before. So for the past 10 years or so, probably more than, and we've tried to build generic acquisition protocol for quantitative MRI of spinal cord at Poly and with colleagues all around the world. We try to provide documentations for acquiring properly the images. We try to make studies about repeatability and reproducibility of measures in the spinal cord with standard head scans. You know, all these research has been just to demonstrate that we can get some good images in the spinal cord as we have done in the past for the brain. So I'm not talking about specific populations here. I'm just talking about structure, different structure in the neuronal system here. We even made videos with Chinese subtitles for colleagues in China to make sure that they were acquiring the images the same way we do, so we can have comparable results, you know. So these efforts, like trying to share the results in an open way, it has been really, really important for us to make the community move in the same direction, to one direction that's gains for the whole community. Sometimes it's not enough, you know. Sometimes you get patients that go into the scanner, we have a good image of the spinal cord here on the left, and sometimes we don't have really nice images, and we didn't know why on this specific case. Well, at the end, when we got him out and trying to ask him how it did go, he told us he was actually always falling asleep and snoring. And so his trachea was vibrating and so inducing motion. So that's the kind of difficulties we have with all the populations that cannot like stay awake into the scanner, and they were snoring, and so we get bad images, and that's extremely difficult to process and analyze after that. And so when we talk about different populations here, we can talk about children that don't move, but then we can also talk about all the populations that have difficulties to stay awake and having good images as well. So there is a lot of things that we can do about that, but that's the main challenge we have, trying to have good images and trying to make sure that we can actually analyze it in a reproducible way. We've been trying to focus on spinal cord imaging for pediatric population as well. The spinal cord is just a tube, we can say, but it's also different when you look at children compared to adults. And so Kolind here has been working on developing analysis method for pediatric population specifically, having quite some good results recently. And all these tools about spinal cord, we've been putting them together at New Poly for a few years into a spinal cord toolbox. The spinal cord toolbox is a tool that we open sourced. And because we open sourced it, a lot of people, a lot of the person in the community were able to use it, then reproduce the results, and then publish their own studies using standard tools. And so releasing tools in open source way, as Stéphanie will talk about a little bit later, well, that's extremely important for me to make neuroimaging more accessible, because it means that other people can actually use a tool that they don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time, so all the tools that we try to develop in my lab, for example, we try to release that in an open source way, and releasing that open source. It also comes with documenting, supporting, etc. I'm not going to all these details. In this image, you see here atlas-based analysis registration framework, because in neuroimaging, we usually use templates. Templates, that's a mini image that we register all the patients onto this image, kind of a reference frame. So when we compare to different populations, well, we have our reference to compare them appropriately. Well, having a reference, what does it mean in terms of populations? What if I take a population in the US, Canada, and then I try to compare with people in China? Well, probably they don't have, well, they have brain, that's for sure, but do they have the same structure? Is that comparable? Well, that's a fair question. So that's what people have been interested into, looking at how do we create templates, so average image, reference space, for a specific population, how it does vary. So when we try to make a study in different populations, comparing people from all around the world, should we use the same reference space? Should we use comparable reference space? And that's a really fair question in terms of diversity in the world. That's also a fair question in terms of pediatric populations. How do we present an average for children that actually grows? The brain is maturing, is developing, and so we shouldn't have an average image. And so building a template that represents a reference space that is moving with the normal neurodevelopment and trying to assess if we have disease, how do you compare with the normality at that age or at that point in life? Well, that's still a huge challenge that we try to overcome here. And part of my lab has been working on that. Angela has been working on trying to develop deep learning techniques to accelerate and improve image registration, specifically for pediatric population, because we have to understand what does it mean to register an image to another image when it's the same brain maturing, developing. It's not exactly the same as trying to register a patient to a template. Specifically, how do we use that to create a template rapidly that is continuous in terms of neurodevelopment? So here I mainly talk about pediatric, but I touch a little bit of all the some of the accessibility problem that we are going to talk here today, in terms of populations, in terms of access to the scanner, in terms of challenges when imaging different structures. So that's the end of my presentation. So thank you a lot for your attention here. And if I may take some questions, I would be happy to. If not, I'm just gonna introduce the next speaker. So I'll open the mic I'll stop sharing. And if anyone has a question, feel free to ask. No. Okay. Let me then just introduce the next speaker. We have, as the next speaker, we have Stéphanie Noble. She's, and tell me if I did wrong, Stéphanie, I'll let you introduce yourself. She's a postdoc at Yale University, working on mainly functional MRI, but she's not necessarily going to talk about that. She's going to talk about, I know Stéphanie actually because she's on the Open Science Special Interest Group at OHPM, one of the main conferences in your field, in neuroimaging, looking at open science, and Stéphanie has a lot of, she's really working on trying to think about open science in terms of inclusivity, diversity. What does it mean for community? You know, that's all important questions that we need to think about, and she's going to talk about that. So Stéphanie, I'll let you introduce yourself again if I miss something, and I'll let you start.
No, that's great. Let me just start sharing. But yes, very much focus on this open science inclusivity angle. Let me just move you guys around so I can make sure I can see everybody. You know, when you start these keynote presentations, you lose your cursor, so it's hard to see. There we go. Okay, perfect. All right. So I'm starting with this argument that open science is inclusive science. And indeed, one of the central tenets of open science is to break barriers and promote access. So that's where we get that inclusive science element. And this is really a movement that's embraced across different scientific disciplines. Some, like computer science, have sort of embraced this earlier than others. But really, you know, all the way to neuroimaging, there's been a lot of attention recently. And I'd like to really drill down specifically in our field and think about how are we doing in terms of really making scientific research inclusive and making the communities inclusive to everybody. So first, looking at neuroscience, I just want to talk about what we mean by underrepresented minorities, so groups that might not be included as much as others. I'm going to talk about this in neuroscience, but this also kind of generalizes to other types of contexts as well. So we tend to see quite a bit of underrepresentation on the basis of sex, gender, and gender identity. And right here, I'm showing a figure that's showing how, as we move to positions that involve more power, so people who are, let's say, speakers invited to be speakers at a conference or in a seminar, compared to people who are authoring publications, which are often trainees as well, we see more and more of this gender disparity in neuroscience. We also see underrepresentation on the basis of sexual orientation, economic development of the country of origin. So I'm showing here a breakdown of country of origin for editors in the top 50 neuroscience journals. And actually, none of these countries are low middle income countries. Also, this relates to socioeconomic status. We also see underrepresentation on the basis of race and ethnicity. This was also a really nice paper that talks actually about the number of times people have been cited sort of as a function of their ethnicity. And we see that there are great disparities, whether you're white versus non-white. And especially if you're a person of color, there tends to be less of this disparity in citation. So disability status, also both mental and physical disability, has been recently made a little bit more part of the conversation. But I'd like to point out that the number of PhDs that have been awarded to scientists with disabilities has really remained stagnant, whereas other types of underrepresented minorities have increased in the number of PhDs awarded. And this is just a few of the topics that have been sort of investigated in neuroscience, but there are many more. So this is neuroscience really broadly, where we have quite a bit of data across many different subfields. We can look at neuroimaging. And I'll say we don't have, actually, I haven't seen published data specifically looking at all the breakdowns of different types of underrepresented minorities. But what we do have is from a couple different groups. So first, the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. On the left here, I'm showing proportions of women in different types of positions. So for instance, as committee members at OHBM, or as that's on the top, or as meeting attendees, which is on the bottom right. And really things have been improving in terms of gender diversity over the years. And in part, this is thanks to the Diversity and Inclusivity Committee, which was formed shortly after 2017. It started as a task force. I'll say we've been doing better in terms of gender diversity. On the right, I'm showing sort of global countries of origins. And you can see really we tend to have a lot more members that come from Western countries than many other types of countries. So that's still kind of a big issue. And this is also echoed in the Brain Hack, which is another major organization that serves the neuroimaging community. And just stepping back for a second, I tried to look at these sort of major organizations in neuroimaging. And these tend to be two big ones that kind of are thought of as serving the neuroimaging community specifically. So for Brain Hack, you can see really the local events that organize their own smaller brain hacks are really disproportionately concentrated in these Western countries. And Brain Hack is thought of as being sort of a more technical space, and that's part of it that I'll come back to later. But so I'm just highlighting, we've made some pretty good strides in terms of gender. It's far from perfect, but there's a lot of other types of diversity that we still need to work on, and a lot of types of diversity we haven't even really measured or reported on. I'll say internally from the Brain Hack side, we've made some internal surveys, and we do also see underrepresentation in a lot of different groups besides gender and actually trainee status. All right, so I'll just give you an overview of what I'll talk about today. So first, I'd like to highlight efforts in neuroimaging to promote inclusivity, then talk about areas in which we really have yet to grow, and highlight ways that you or others who may be interested in getting involved can join our efforts. So let's first talk about initiatives in neuroimaging. And I'm going to start by talking about the major groups, the major organizations in neuroimaging, and these also have subgroups that promote inclusivity. So there's OHBM, as we talked about. This is sort of the major neuroimaging conference and society. So there are three subgroups that are promoted to inclusivity, committed to inclusivity. There's the DIC, Diversity Inclusivity Committee, formed 2017, the OSSIG, Open Science Special Interest Group, and the Student Postdoc Special Interest Group. So these are all groups that are sort of have their own specific focus, but they tend to work together in terms of promoting inclusivity and finding common challenges with inclusion. And you'll notice these really started, 2014, 2016, 2017, so not that long ago. And we can talk about Brain Hack as well. There are three groups that were all started within the past year. So there's a diversity, equity, and inclusivity team that we started, really noting that we were kind of falling behind other groups, an outreach team and an onboarding team. And I want to point out Brain Hack is fully volunteer led. So you see a little bit more of this difference between groups that are major societies that have lots of funding and can pay volunteers, or these other societies that are really volunteer driven and don't have the same sort of funding. All right. So let's look at a few initiatives from those two different groups. So I'll just start by pointing out on the left side here, on the right side here, OHBM actually released a paper that talks about various issues and things that they've concretely done to address each of these issues. So I encourage you to check that out. I'm just going to highlight a few here. So one is they've kind of promoted this sort of internal audit of activities taking place at OHBM. So for instance, looking at who is actually on the OHBM committee and making sure that we have some attention to promoting diversity there. Also looking at symposia and considering diversity of the speakers as a factor that should be taken into consideration for which symposia we highlight. They've also released a code of conduct and, importantly, a means of reporting violations of this code of conduct. There's also been a couple efforts specifically for families because, as we know, many people, especially women who choose to have a family, might end up not attending a conference to take care of a child or staying at home, and often eventually they could leave academia. So there have been a few efforts to sort of support those people who decide, who have families. So one is childcare grants, which are now being renamed to caretaker grants. And another is a variety of outreach events that are geared towards children, such as a kids review. So that's OHBM. We'll talk a little bit about BrainHack. So BrainHack has a number of resources. We actually haven't published on the DI activities. It's very early for us, but I'm just highlighting some of these resources here. You can feel free to visit that link and borrow anything here. But we created an accessibility checklist for people who lead local brain hacks, just to make sure, for instance, that everybody can attend the virtual conferences. You know, if people are deaf or hard of hearing, that they can actually have subtitles, or if possible, interpreters. There have also been a number of efforts on the outreach front to make sure that the messaging that we get out to advertise BrainHack are both really inclusive, that are written in newcomer-friendly language, and also are translated into another number of different languages. So here's a tweet that was translated into 3 of maybe about 10 or 15 different languages, sort of advertising what a brain hack is and why it might provide some professional development opportunities for people. And there's also been a really cool initiative. Both of these are led by Valentina Borghesani. There's been a really cool initiative to create a video highlighting members of the community in many different languages as well, just talking about what they've gained from BrainHack. And I want to say Valentina also led the kids review in that previous slide, so she's been doing some really cool stuff. And I just mentioned Valentina. There are a lot of different people who have been volunteering to put all these initiatives together, a lot of different sub-teams. So it's really important that we recognize, you know, the work that often goes unrecognized. So thank you to all those people who are associated with those groups in the previous 2 slides. Okay, so that's neuroimaging specific initiatives. Now I'd like to talk about neuroscience specific initiatives, so more general. So there are a number of groups that are geared towards promoting diversity in neuroscience. I've just named a number of them here. There are many more. I'd like to point out there's the one group that is sort of URM general, that's promoting diversity across different types of underrepresentation, is the ALBA network. That's sort of a European, a group that emerged in Europe, but of course anybody can join. And there are also many, many more organizations that have subgroups that promote DEI. There are federal organizations, which I'm going to talk about more in a sec. Industry grants, for instance, groups in academia that are doing really great work, especially geared towards professional development. I'm highlighting, you know, the Yale Diversity Collective and the Brain Education Day that takes place at Yale. But I think many institutions have the same thing, a sort of professional development collective and an outreach day that's geared towards members of the underrepresented community. There have also been a number of journals that have taken this sort of promoting diversity to heart, and a number of organizations, some of which are geared specifically, that are built around URMs. So this is just kind of a taste of what a lot of people have been doing in neuroscience. But I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to NIH, just because that's something that I personally have been either involved in or have the most awareness of. So there are a number of different things that have been supported by NIH or have been proposed by NIH itself. So I think a really great model that we can follow in neuroimaging that I'll talk about in a bit in terms of following them is the Society for Neuroscience's Neuroscience Scholars Program. It's both a travel award to the conference and a professional development suite of activities geared towards PhD level trainees. NIH has, so that's from the Society of Neuroscience. NIH specifically has a couple of grants that are geared towards supporting URMs. So this is a PhD to postdoc transition award. This is both a grant and a professional development program. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested in applying for this award and provide materials. There's also the brain counterpart to this, which is a postdoc to faculty level transition award. And they've actually talked about how through these awards, they were able to sort of level the playing field a bit in terms of who gets awarded, who gets to participate in NIH funding. And there's actually a number of NIH-specific initiatives for funding underrepresented minorities. And I'll point out here, the NIH has recently widened the definition of URMs to also include people from economic backgrounds that are underrepresented in academia. So I like this idea of considering a lot of different types of diversity, which we'll talk about later as well. All right. So there are a lot of great things that people are doing. But as we all know, we are far from having a perfectly diverse and well-represented group of scientists in academia. So here's what I think of as some major gaps. And a big one is how to broaden our reach. So right now we have a very Western-centric construal of what diversity means. This often tends to overlook. Oh, hello. Sorry, did somebody want to ask a question? Or are they just sort of weighing in, like, why is this? Yeah. Yeah, so we tend to overlook like low middle income countries. OHBM actually has specific travel awards for low middle income countries, which is, I think, really important. But we tend to overlook these. We tend to overlook marginalized ethnic groups. Right now, we have very small representation in terms of disability or non-binary gender identity, sexual orientation, and SES. We need to address this problem by getting more involvement from local communities. So it's not very helpful for somebody from a privileged position who's not in a community to say, oh, you're going to get a lot out of Brain Hack, you should join our community. It's not, it seems more like an outsider speaking to another group, and it doesn't feel very trustworthy. So I think that's a big challenge for us. And I think these problems all go double for technical spaces. So spaces like Brain Hack or anything that sort of purports to be an open science space. Christy Whitaker and Olivia Guest wrote this really nice piece in The Psychologist about quote unquote broken science. So this sort of open science culture, which can sometimes have these privileged groups that make it seem like a really closed culture that's not open to other groups, that you're not an open science person if you don't do all of these things, or like you don't quite fit with the culture of, the open science quote unquote bros. And they're just pointing out that that's not really, certain groups maybe haven't done everything, but still should have a seat at the table. That we should really be thinking of open science as a more inclusive space. I think another major challenge revolves around virtual conferencing. So virtual conferencing, there was a big conversation about this last year at OHBM, and it's a really compelling solution to breaking down a lot of barriers and allowing access. You can think from the perspective of some of the people you may have heard or you might have felt yourself, we're not having in-person conferences, that's so sad. I'm missing out on all these socializing opportunities and getting to go visit, France or Montreal as we missed out recently. But you might imagine that there are many groups that don't necessarily have the funds to just go on an international adventure and take all of their lab members internationally with them. Or people who have just started families that might not be able to leave kids behind. So virtual conferencing is a really nice solution to some of those problems. But the big question at the heart of this is, how can we make these more engaging? How can we make them offer the same benefits as an in-person conference? And there's a paper here that talks a bit about this, and Neuromatch is a great model for this. So I just urge you to check out what they're doing. I think we're also missing some opportunities for funding and professional development for URM trainees in neuroimaging. Again, volunteer-led organizations like Brain Hack have traditionally had limited funds, but I think OHBM has the funds. And another problem, I think, is how to combine efforts across groups so we're not replicating the same efforts, duplicating efforts. Finally, I really like this idea from Pierre Belek, how to promote this culture of inclusivity in science. So he recently posted in a Brain Hack community channel, there was this poster on the left that talked about all these drivers of power abuse in academia, strong hierarchies like competition and more of an emphasis on the individual. But Brain Hack actually has the opposite sort of structure of its governance. It's horizontal governance. It's more emphasizing collaboration rather than competition, and it's more focused on team science rather than individual-led science. So I think if we can think of ways that we can shift some of the governance structures to have more of this sort of attitude, which is also really consistent with an open science kind of organization, it would be very helpful for many contexts. Okay, so how do we actually address these gaps? Many organizations are thinking about these and other issues, and we should think about educating ourselves and our communities on how to better address them. So there are a number of solutions that have been laid out that are evidence-based and requested by UM communities. And I think those are the two most important things to think about when you're thinking about solutions. So I'm going to show really quickly just a few publications that have talked about some of these solutions in a good way. So the first is from a survey of 16,000 people worldwide from the Boston Consulting Group. This is really geared towards companies, actually, but we can adapt this definitely for our institutions. So I'm not going to go through this in the interest of time, but they really break it down by specific solutions that are requested for different minority groups. These three groups, there are many others, but I think it's a really good start. And they also talk about solutions that are agreed upon by all of these different groups. So I think this one's worth checking out. So the ALBA network actually, the ALBA network also put together a number of solutions that was proposed by its own members. And this talks about solutions that can be implemented at the individual and organization level. And then finally, there's a publication from WinRepo, the Women in Neuroscience Repository, that was put together from feedback from all of its membership, which is a pretty large membership at this point. And this also breaks it down institutions, organizations, and individuals. So you can think of, what institutions you're part of, or whether you as an individual want to make change, and you can implement these changes at all of those levels. All right, so those are some solutions. I want to give a little bit of advice that you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there's something you want to do and there are others who have already done it really well, I think it's really great to sort of emulate what they've been doing, and you can always reach out to those people. I've had a lot of conversations with people from a lot of different spaces. Just so you know, yeah, I'm the inclusivity officer for the Open Science Special Interest Group, and I also am one of the founders of the BrainHack Diversity Inclusivity group. And I've reached out to a lot of people, or had people reach out to me, and everyone, like across the board that I've had conversations with, are more than happy, super giving of their time, and more than happy to help. So please feel free to reach out. I also think it's really important to leave time for integrity checks. It really takes a lot of time to do all of these things. If you're in a time crunch and you're planning a panel, you might just reach out to the most famous people. You might not think a little bit more broadly about who hasn't really spoken up in this area as much. So leave that time. And you can always, join a team. Most of these groups are pretty young and basically always looking for volunteers. So I would encourage you to join in something where you feel inspired. So just to wrap things up, a lot of communities in neuroimaging have taken steps towards promoting inclusivity. This is really part of the fabric of larger efforts taking place across neuroscience. But as we all know, a lot of work remains. So please join us. There are lots of ways that you can still contribute. With that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. Does anyone have any question? Let me ask one to break the ice. So it's obvious that we need to make the neuroimaging community more diverse and inclusive. Have you seen the impact of it already? Because it's pretty young, right? So what is the impact of making our community more diverse and inclusive? For example, research. Did anyone has tried to measure to convince us that obviously that's the way to go, but how do we change things, and how does it change things?
That's a really, really great question. And it's one that a lot of people have answered from a lot of different angles. So I think people have asked this question in scientific disciplines more broadly. But I'll start by a lot of people are prioritizing the fact that this is something that despite the evidence that it makes science better, that this is something we should be doing just because it's the right thing to do. You know, people have the right to be able to pursue their interests. You know, they have the right to not be discriminated against for things that are outside of their control. Yeah, so I'd like to highlight that first. But I think there has been evidence that, you know, more diverse teams tend to be better at problem solving. They bring in, you know, different perspectives. It's sort of like, you know, the funding agencies like the NIH, they'll put some amount of funding in sort of sure solutions, but they'll also spread out funding to sort of more risky projects as well, because some of them might be, you know, game changers. So it's really useful to have this diversity of opinions. And then there's sort of the basic fact that when you don't allow these opportunities to be available to such a big portion of the population, you're just missing out on the potential to have more scientists. You know, you're limiting your scientific workforce. So I think those are like several kind of common perspectives I see in response to that question.
I completely agree. It's the right thing to do, and then we need to. We are actually already seeing the impact of it already. Maybe just a last questions before we switch. And if anyone has a question, feel free to open your mic, of course. Do you think we do a good job compared to other communities? Because in the neuroimaging community has been open for a long time. Recently, we starting initiatives to make it more inclusive, diverse, more accessible. This panel is one example, but do you think we do a good job compared to others?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I would say both yes and no. Yes, because I'd say neuroimaging is uniquely focused on open science and uniquely embraces open science and is interested in making, you know, the space more inclusive and sharing, which is really unique to many other sciences. Like a lot of psychology is not like that. So I think that that's very unique. But on the other hand, it's often seen as a much more technical field. And with that, there tends to be a little bit more of this feeling that it's a broken science, a really kind of exclusive, privileged culture where, you know, URMs tend to disproportionately feel this feeling of imposter syndrome. So they might see like for instance, a brain hack event and think, oh, I don't have the technical skills to join, more often than people of other groups, which is unfortunate because they usually do. So I'd say like in those ways, there's the yes and the no. I'd also like to mention I've mentioned some of these groups like the NSP and the NIH DSPAN, and I have a community of peers in these groups that are really fantastic neuroimaging scientists, but I don't see them at places like OHBM. So I think in that way, like that to me is kind of a clear example that we're not. And they say that they don't feel like, you know, there are people like them there and it feels not as inclusive. So I think that's sort of a concrete example of how, you know, we are kind of failing these groups and making this feel like an inclusive culture.
Get it. Thank you. Does anyone has any question at this point? Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Stéphanie. We'll move on to our next group of speakers because it's not only one person, but it's three person. So we have Shannon, Kolind, we have Adam, Dvorak, and sorry if I mess up your names, folks, and Sharada Balaji from UBC, so University of British Columbia. They're going to talk about another aspect of accessibility neuroimaging, which is low field MRI. We've always tended to go higher in the field, and recently we've seen some new technologies happening. So I'll let them start with their presentation and actually a live demo of this new technology. Looks like we cannot unmute yourself.
Perfect.
Oh.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. So this is going to be a very informal presentation, and I apologize for the mask since we're sharing the space. So if you're having trouble hearing us at all, please do speak up, especially when we start actually running the scanner. Okay, so we're just going to have a handful of slides, which I started from the middle, so that's a good start. There we go. So we're just going to talk about driving low field MRI quite literally forward, trying to rethink our maps. I wanted to start with some disclosures. So we don't have anything particularly relevant for this talk, but I did want to point out that we do have the scanner that we're going to be talking about on loan through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So just to keep that in mind as a disclosure. So yeah, we're getting the privilege of getting to work with this low field MRI scanner. So this has been developed by a company called Hyperfine based out of Connecticut. So this is a 64 millitesla MRI scanner, so far, far lower magnetic field strength than we're used to using for clinical scans. And it is very portable. So it's a picture of it we took outside of our center here in Vancouver, us trying to maneuver it in and out of an elevator, and our very willing and compliant, shall be unnamed, grad students willing to jump in on the very first day that we got it using some tables that we found to try to squeeze into the scanner. So it was quite an amazing experience for those of us who've worked in MRI for a long time to receive the scanner, uncrate it, drive it through the hospital, and start scanning people on it all within the same day. So I want to show you what some of the images that are coming off of the scanner look like. So this is a T2 weighted scan. This is just the standard out-of-the-box scan for T2. It took about 5.5 minutes. They're 5 millimeter thick slices. And again, for those of us who've been working in MRI for a while, we were quite shocked at the image quality, considering that we're at 20 times lower field than even a 1.5 Tesla clinical scanner. Okay, so I'm going to hand over the reins to Adam to point out some features of the scanner.
Yeah, so I'll just scooch this over here. Hopefully you can see. Actually, this might be easier. Okay, we'll go selfie mode. So if you're familiar with a normal MRI scanner,
can I suggest that you unshare so we have you in the main?
Yeah.
Yes.
I tried something which is spotlight for everyone, and I don't know if that works, but you should be on the screen of everyone.
Okay.
There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Awesome. All right. So the first thing you'd notice is that it's much, much smaller. It's pretty small. We kind of joke that it's about halfway between R2-D2 and a really big trash bin. And the scanner itself weighs 1,400 pounds. So it is actually pretty heavy, despite the fact that it looks so small. And so I thought I'd just kind of start at the top and work my way down and show you some of the unique features about this. So probably the first thing people notice is the hula hoop that we have here. This is actually our 5 Gauss line. So this can collapse and fold all the way in so that you can fit the scanner through doorways. And yeah, so it kind of just slides in, and then you can expand it right out so that we have our actual 5 Gauss line, which is sort of the safety line for 5 Gauss magnetic field within that line. Then making our way down, we have probably what I think is one of the most unique tricks that really makes the scanner work so well. And it's these little white boxes. You can see, might be kind of hard to see, but there's one here, there's another there. And there are a few sort of spread in key locations around the scanner. And those are actually sensors that are detecting electromagnetic interference or signal. And so for a normal MRI scanner, you put it in a room with a Faraday cage, which is going to be blocking out other types of RF signal. But for this scanner, the only Faraday cage we really have is this sort of guard thing here. And so this can slide open all the way around and then kind of slide closed like that. But at the end of the day, we'll be scanning and we'll be sitting here with a bunch of laptops, and you could even have a radio sitting here playing if you wanted. And based on what we've done so far, it's very, very robust to those sorts of noise sources. Then moving on down, we have the top part of the permanent magnet assembly. So it's for people less on the technical side. It's like basically some very serious fridge magnets we have going on here. And so it's like a superconducting MRI that you'd find at a hospital. The magnet is always on, but it's much, much weaker. So Shannon mentioned it's 64 millitesla, which is obviously a lot lower. Then when we get in here, we have our head coil. And it's pretty cool. It is actually a multi-channel receive coil. So for the MR people out there, it's an 8-channel head coil. And this can detach and pop right out. And right now, the scanner only officially supports this head coil, but they've got a bunch of other stuff in development that I probably won't get into. Here is the bed. So usually you'd have a subject on a stretcher. And this is one of a few things we've been working on, is trying to find really smooth ways to get people in and out for scanning. And so this can support 440 pounds. And usually if it's unnamed grad students, then we just kind of shimmy our way up and in. But theoretically, we're going to be using this with people who are less mobile. And so we're working on a few different approaches for how to help them get in much more easily. Then moving our way down, we've got kind of the lower area in here, which is where the scanner computer is. So I think one thing that's really neat in regards to accessibility is that these are supposed to be able to run sort of middle of nowhere without an internet connection. So it has a lot of hard drive storage on it, so you can scan for a pretty extended period of time without being hooked up to a network. And then you can, at a later point, connect to Ethernet, which you can see there's just a little Ethernet port on the side there, and then it uploads all the data to a cloud storage system. That Ethernet port is one of only 2 wires on the whole thing, really. So we just have our Ethernet port and our power cable. And then down at the very bottom, then we get to these kind of caster wheels on the outside. But what you can't see too well is that underneath there are 2 big wheels, and those are actually driven. So there's there's an electric motor. As I mentioned, the scanner's 1,400 pounds. It's pretty heavy. And so there's an electric motor to drive it around, which you do with this joystick right here. So you kind of get one hand on here and the other on the joystick. And we always joke that the hardest part about using this scanner is learning how to drive it through really tight doorways. The actual operation of the scanner is all done through a browser, which can be on your smartphone, on a laptop, or on an iPad that actually comes with the scanner. But it's a super easy interface, and it's really designed for people who aren't familiar or trained with MR, really. Yeah, so definitely feel free to throw in questions in the chat or in the section later, but that's kind of a really quick whirlwind overview of what this is and how it differs from a standard MRI.
Okay. Back in position. Okay. If anybody has any questions about the scanner itself, I mean, we'll just keep going, but we're happy to kind of go through it. Yeah, I see Julianne. Hi, Julianne.
Hi, thank you very much for taking the time doing this. This is very exciting. First time that I'm seeing this live demo of a Hyperfine system. So I have a lot of questions, but maybe in terms of the interface, is that like a completely new proprietary software? How open is that? And are you planning to develop some sequences or modify them? Is that possible?
Yeah, all great questions. So the actual interface, it's basically just, it's just a website, so you can open it on any device, and it is proprietary to them. So actually, maybe I really don't need the slides. So we have 2 major projects that we're working on with this ourselves. So the way that we got involved was through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so they're interested in taking these scanners and getting them into low and middle income countries, ultimately for clinical use, but currently for research use. So they already have interest in a lot of these different places with a ton of different projects. A lot of them are looking at nutrition, effects of nutrition on development, mostly pediatric applications. And obviously there's very, very limited access to MRI. I mean, even in Canada, we think of ourselves as not having much access, but we're, light years beyond a lot of these other places. So they initially bought 10 units to distribute to low and middle income countries across sub-Saharan Africa and India and Pakistan. And then 10 to go to physics development sites, of which we are one. And so we're each kind of tasked with developing applications within our wheelhouse of our expertise that will have applications for these different populations, and to work very directly with these populations to really in real time test them out, not only here in our population, but also in the field, in the actual cases that we want them to apply for. So our specialty here in Vancouver at UBC tends to be myelin sensitive imaging. So that will be kind of our focus for developing with the scanner. So we're working on still contracts, but we'll have an expert mode agreement. So the typical software, you just have a list of scans, and actually maybe we'll show that now. Thank you, go ahead. So when you open the interface, then yeah, apologies for, it's easier to look there to see what it looks like. So you'll just see kind of a list of scans, and you just pick an exam. So you might pick an exam for migraine, and it will just run a bunch of scans. But essentially, you only have access to a T1 weighted, a T2 weighted, a diffusion weighted image, a PD. You just hit go, and you have no control over any of the parameters. But with expert mode agreement, we're able to go in and change some of those parameters. And we just found out last week that Sharada, Adam, and I here will be going down to Hyperfine headquarters along with Julian. You'll remember Emil Lundberg, who did his master's with me and is now a postdoc in Lund. To actually get to play with the actual programming to institute some new sequences. So one of our first ones to work on will be an MT sequence. So it's been a lot of fun to rethink the physics kind of from the beginning of how do you do an MT sequence at low fields. The other project that we're doing is for application in MS, multiple sclerosis. So that's just kind of the other end of things. So instead of looking at myelin development, we look at the myelin damage, and I can show you some of the early work that some of the other groups have done with that. That was a really long answer to, I think, fairly short question.
Yeah, I know, but it covers pretty much most of the questions that I had. Yeah, no, thank you. So with respect to myelin imaging, are you going in the direction of like myelin water fraction?
We'd love to be able to do that. It's going to be tricky, obviously. So we're kind of looking at lots of different ways to approach it. So just looking at things that would be kind of myelin weighted just by getting, fewer echoes, using some of the T1 information, and yeah, MT approaches as well. So yeah, we're going to play with a whole bunch, as many different things as we can get our hands dirty with, for sure.
And in terms of acquisition time, so I saw from the iPad, like the T2 weighted would be like 15 minutes approximately. So the diffusion weighted was like 43 minutes, is that right?
That was the whole exam. So typically the scans tend to be about the same length as you would see on a clinical scanner, but you're not getting the same resolution. So pretty much everything by default is a 5 millimeter thick, kind of 1:2-ish, 1.5, yeah, resolution. So one of the things that Sean Dione and his group have been developing is acquiring in multiple different axes and then reconstructing. So that obviously is going to take a bit longer, but then you can get more resolution when you need it for different things. And again, once we can get into the software, we want to come up with some tricks to take advantage of the fact that you're doing different things in different directions to get more information out of it.
Is that more interesting to go that route as opposed to having isotropic resolution with like keeping the same volume, like voxel volume?
So it just depends, right, on your application. So one of the nice things about acquiring thicker slices in multiple dimensions is that you might be able to get slightly different scans in each of those different dimensions, so that you're getting more information at once. And also if you're dealing with something like a pediatric population, and one of the main benefits here is that you don't need sedation for the kids because it's much less claustrophobic and it's not expensive. So if there's movement between the scans, then you can do some registration, rather than one really long scan that you might get swallowing or snoring partway through and have to start again.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. So we were gonna, maybe let's show the scans that we already acquired. So we've just got fruit in it right now. We're still working on ethics to actually scan a person live. It's a little bit tricky. So we've just piled it full of fruit, as you do when you get a new scanner. So that was a 5-minute acquisition. So everyone can maybe try to guess the fruits after. The T1 of the same fruit in that scanner. Yeah, and And then do you want to, we'll try maybe running a scan and we'll see how loud it is and how much it interferes, so you can kind of see what it, what it looks like as it runs. So Sharada's just picked it off of the list and hit play, and we'll see how it goes. So this is what the, tilt that way. Nope, delay. What the interface will look like. So it tells you the time that it's going to take to acquire it, and then that it'll take some more time to reconstruct, and it does a whole lot of corrections for the inhomogeneity and all those different noise corrections. Can you still hear me right now? Sort of, okay. And then we'll show you a scan. So right now it's still showing the previous scan that we acquired, but as it starts to fill case space, it will update the image, and it will come in at first looking pretty terrible because it's just reconstructing from a very small amount of case space, and then it'll gradually improve as it adds data. And then at the end, it'll apply all these corrections and then snap to, and it'll look much better after those reconstructions. One of those things that you can turn on and off is the machine learning reconstruction. And so there's the ability to upload all of your data to the cloud, which we don't do in Canada because it's currently hosted in the US, but they are going to eventually extend that to Canada. And use all of that data to improve all of their machine learning algorithms to better fit the data with very limited actual case space points. That was actually just FDA approved not too long ago.
Yeah.
Which is quite exciting, but we found that even with it off, it still works quite well. It just makes it look a little bit nicer with it on. And this was not trained on actual images, because then obviously you'd be quite prone to try to make it look like, you know, your control data. So it was on like little portions of images. Do you want to talk about that? Do you know more about that?
Yeah.
We don't really know.
They're still working on like patenting various parts of what they're doing. So at the moment, it's not as open as I think it will be in terms of technical implementation of what they're doing.
Yeah, so you can see some of the data coming in. And it sounds like a real scanner. It's quieter, so it's actually below the decibel level that requires earplugs, but if you're in there all the time, it's probably still a good idea. But it is quite an interesting experience being in the room getting scanned while all of your team is around you chatting and joking, and you're trying not to laugh and participate in the conversation. So yeah, it's quite a different experience, but it's quite nice for people that are claustrophobic. And that was, you know, it was interesting seeing earlier talking about getting kids comfortable with getting in the scanner. If you're able to have mom in here holding the hand, or dad, you know, reading a story, or you know, hold on to your stuffed animal or whatever it is, then that can be a lot less scary of a experience. There's obviously a lot less contraindications as well. So they're working with Frank Shellock right now, the famous safety MRI expert, to develop actual guidelines. But there's very few things that would be a contraindication for within the field strength. What else do we want to say about that? Yeah, Julian.
So it says not for medical use, but so you mentioned that like some FDA approval. So how will that, you know, when will it become diagnostic use, or maybe that's just a version of the software? Or?
For sure, yeah. So it is Health Canada approved, but only certain sequences. So we've got access to some of the developmental research scans. So if there's certain protocols, so there's like a stroke protocol that is approved, that you can just run that. Now you still are of course limited by the radiology read, and that's an active area of research as well, as how these things are getting read. Okay, so it's quieter now. It's finished with the actual scan, but it's still worth watching it improve as it goes to the final version. But hopefully keep that up there for a second. Yeah, what else was I going to say about that? I lost my train of thought. But the images are surprisingly good, even with the fruit. So even with using the machine learning, it definitely on the fruit, even though obviously it wasn't trained on fruit, it still does a good job, and you'll see the final image will be like quite a bit nicer, which is really kind of an interesting part of it as well. I should say the cost is in the neighborhood of $100,000 Canadian, or a little bit less than that. So obviously compared to the cost of a clinical MRI scanner, which of course will be over $1 million, and then the infrastructure as well. So having your shielded room and your cooling and everything, and of course the highly trained personnel, it's a very small fraction of the cost. There's annual fees for accessing all of their maintenance and cloud usage and all of that kind of thing. We had the first one to arrive in Canada, which was very exciting, and getting it across the border was an experience. I'm now much more knowledgeable about customs and border crossings and truck routes than I was, but it was followed very shortly thereafter by one that went to Winnebago, Ontario, which is a small northern community where they really don't have access to any imaging at all. I believe the closest thing is a CT in Timmins, which is still quite a distance away. So they're interested in seeing if they can supplement the care with the Hyperfine scanner. So that's good.
Shannon, I have a questions regarding the northern, like isolated territories or indigenous lands. When you're up north, you will not have actually, you will have just GPs, sometimes only nurses. If you don't have the neurologist available to do the follow-up with the patient, what is the added value of the portable MRI?
Yeah. So yeah, and that's an open question, right? Is how each different center is going to handle these things. So we've been hearing from lots of different areas about how they're doing it. So certain countries are looking at actually crowdsourcing the radiology reads. So just making it available and having people who, you know, on their off time are going to come in and do a read, or people that are retired, or that sort of thing. Much telehealth has been working recently. And then for major applications, you know, so a lot of the usage is going to end up being in emergency rooms or in, you know, within the stroke unit, for those kind of on the spot things that you need to know about. There was certainly a lot of usage during COVID. If people were too sick to go to MRI, but you want to know if they had a stroke or not, you can wheel it right up to the bedside and do that assessment quite quickly. But this is going to be a big question in the Canadian healthcare system, is how could it integrate into care? And so that's one of the questions we wanted to get feedback from the people in this group about as well, is like, what are going to be some of those challenges, and are they worth tackling compared to our current infrastructure? It does all go straight up to the cloud, like within all of the, so it gets uploaded straight to PACS, and then you can access it from anywhere. And I get a notification to my phone with thumbnails every time that somebody scans on the scanner. So, you know, you can have people getting alerts like that as well. So it is potentially possible that you could have telehealth from a neurologist that's remote in real time.
Yeah, obviously it requires telehealth to have its own, you know,
Yes.
there are communities of practice working on this really hard as well. So so there's really two branches. The one within hospitals, let's say, bringing the machine to the patients instead of the patients to the machine, and then the use that can be done in more distant territories.
Yeah. Hi, Jillian.
So sorry for all the questions. So I'm looking at their website. So it's called the SWOOP system, right?
That's right.
I can't find the X and Y gradients. What's the trick?
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm not sure quite what you're asking, but I know their maximum gradient strengths are like 25 millitesla per meter, and they have bipolar gradients. We've got some of the specifications, but
so there are like 3 linear gradients, right? X, Y, Z. Where are they located? Like on the system here, I don't see where they would be placed.
Yeah, we're not actually sure. We were kind of speculating whether they might use the intrinsic field inhomogeneity in some way,
which they would need to rotate, like what they did in at the at MGH, with their permanent magnet system that they rotate in order to map, like to change the static field.
Yeah, we don't know. Maybe we'll know more after we get to go visit.
And in terms of shimming, is there a shimming procedure involved? Is that like?
There definitely is. So we definitely run all the pre-scans that do various levels of shim. But we, again, because we're still in the basic mode, we don't have any real control or get to see any of the details. And I think the typical customer won't. I mean, ultimately, we hope that it'll be like the other manufacturers where researchers will get more access. But right now, with them just being a brand new company, having just hit the market around Christmas time, I think they're keeping a pretty close eye on the IP. But we can definitely pick various different shim routines out of our list of scans.
Quick follow-up questions about what you just said. The IP, usually the manufacturers that are not too open to researchers, but with a kind of a closed IP deals, you know. Do you feel Hyperfine goes the same way, or do you think they're more open than other manufacturers?
We're really hopeful. It's been really great interacting with them over the last few months. And I think because this is such a huge collaboration with the Gates Foundation, and I didn't give you the follow-up information that we started with 10 in low and middle income countries. It's already been expanded to 70. So they're a huge customer at this point, and it's all sort of associated around this research project. So they're very motivated, and I mean, it kind of makes sense to be able to get some of the researchers around the world that are keen, especially at this stage, to be pitching ideas and trying to help, especially when it's a relatively small company. So certainly they've been very supportive of us. Our clinical scientist, Megan Foreman, is amazing. She trained in Tennessee. You might know her from Vanderbilt. But yeah, it's a great culture. People are definitely keen, but I mean, it remains to be seen how it goes. Fingers crossed. Yeah. So yeah, just because I want to make sure that we get a chance to show you some of the stuff Sharada's been doing. I'll quickly. Are we still sharing? No, we need to share.
Are you in contact with the other 10 centers? So you exchange,
Yes.
or yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
what about the ones in the other countries?
Yes, yeah. So we just actually had a all hands meeting yesterday to get to hear a very brief overview from some of the research projects in some of the situations, mostly in Africa and Pakistan. And then to keep up, and then we have kind of subgroups, all organized through teams, obviously, since it's a Gates Foundation grant, to keep tabs on who's working on what, so we can be collaborative and not stepping on each other's toes too much. So for example, Derek Jones is doing work in diffusion, and the work Tommy's doing work with T1, T2 mapping, that sort of thing.
Do you know if some people are focusing on developing coils, RF coils for it?
Yeah, we do know that that they are. I don't know how much they've shared the load of that development work yet, but they have a bunch of different prototype coils for everything from joints and even MSK stuff to probably of most interest to you would be cervical cord imaging. So they even have played around with removing the RF shield at the back to get someone further into isocenter, and then trying to build cervical spine coils.
I'm just going to play this, but we can keep chatting while it's playing. Just to show you what driving it around looks like. And this is one of the times I didn't crash it into anything. But it makes me feel very happy that I spent so much time playing video games. But yeah, maneuvering it through the doorways. It does fit through kind of a standard hospital doorway. You need, was it
34 inches.
34 inches. Yeah. But yeah, it can be kind of a tight squeeze. So this is the area that we're in now in the imaging center. There's Laura Barlow, our head MR tech, who's been very supportive and is keen on it.
So how, so there is still a permanent magnet in there. So how careful should you be when you manipulate this? And how close can you go with your iPhone, for example?
Well, I think we'll admit that all of us have at some point left on our Apple Watch or whatever right into the center of the bore, and so far so good. It's really not that strong. I've worn my mask in and it will pull on the kind of metal a very, very little bit. It's not very noticeable.
The developers at Hyperfine will sometimes set stuff up and then climb into the scanner themselves holding their iPhone or something to start the scan.
Yeah. So it's not that strong. It took us quite a while to get ethics. We just got it through, I think, last week to get to scan people. And that was very helpful when the Health Canada approval came through, because we had been working on on an ITA, but I wanted to give Sharada a chance to show this is work that she'll be presenting at ISMRM that we did with a fixed brain. So thank you. Sure. So because one of our primary focuses is MS, and we weren't able to scan people in vivo yet because of ethics reasons, we decided to see if we could actually see lesions in ex vivo tissue. So we had access to an ex vivo brain hemisphere from someone with MS. And we decided to do 3 kinds of scans, one at 3T with high resolution, one at 3T with lower resolution that matched the hyperfines, which is about 37 times bigger voxel size than the 3T, and one with the hyperfine itself. And yeah, short answer is yes, you can see many of the lesions. So in the figures over here, A and B, there's 3 columns, the leftmost one being the gold standard 3T, the middle one being the lower resolution 3T, and the right one being the hyperfine scan. And you can see these little arrows pointing out the same lesions that you can see here and in this set of figures. However, there were a bunch that we couldn't actually see. So for example, in figure A over here, we have the little blue arrows pointing out this mild hyperintensity. By the way, these are all T2 weighted images. These blue arrows are pointing out this mild hyperintensity, which isn't definitively a lesion, but you can actually see it on the 3T scans. And in figure B, there's this whole slew of tiny lesions that you can see on the high-res 3T, but not on either lower resolution. So this is sort of leading us towards thinking that it's resolution and not field strength that plays a major role in lesion visibility, which was something that was corroborated by another group.
Yeah, and just to answer Ava's question, this was using the machine learning reconstruction, yes. So this is work that we did not do, so not taking credit here. This is out of UPenn in collaboration with NIH, Campbell Arnold, who's a PhD student, working with Joel Stein, a radiologist. And so they had hold of one of these for a whole different application, but got interested in seeing if it would work in MS. And it had many patients come through and get scanned on the hyperfine after their 3T scan to see if you can see the lesions. And this is their ECTRIMS poster from last year. So you can go and see the whole poster there if you want to see more details. But that gives you a little bit of an example of what the images look like. And we were really pleasantly surprised that you could see lesions so clearly on these scans. And then they ran it through, they had both a manual segmentation that was done by 2 different radiologists, and then they had the automated lesion segmentation using Taki's Mimosa algorithm as well. And they actually found, so on the left there, a really strong correlation between the automated lesion load that was detected between the 64 millitesla and the 3 Tesla scans. There was an offset, so it's missing some of the small lesions at 64 millitesla, and it's overestimating some of the big ones because it's picking up some artifact, just needs. Okay, can you hear me again? Great. So yeah, so it really just needs some optimization of the flare sequence, I think. And I should say this was using the default resolution at both field strengths. So it was much higher resolution for the 3T scans than for the 64 millitesla scans. And then for the manual segmentation, again, they had good overlap between the diameters that they were measuring for the large lesions, but not for the small lesions. But again, we suspect this probably comes down to resolution more so than the actual field strength. What is the T2 in white matter 64 and how does that impact imaging parameters? Yeah, good question. So we've started playing around with some mapping approaches that some of the other groups have been developing, but we had to pause for ethics while we were waiting for some ethics and contracts to come through. It's not that different, actually. So with the fixed brain, the bigger effect is from it being fixed, which is the bigger problem. So we did have to adjust the scans for that fact, which we have to do on the 3T as well. But I don't know if we have any actual numbers, but it's not actually that much shorter.
No, yeah, based on, of course, since it was fixed brain, we had to fiddle around with the TE imaging parameter to catch that really short relaxation component, since everything gets so much shorter in fixed tissue. But yeah, the change in TE was actually pretty much the same. I think we went with almost the same, effective TE on the 3T. Yeah, so it looks like from what we've done that T1 changes a fair bit, but T2 is pretty constant.
Yeah, T1 obviously being quite a bit shorter, which can be useful for some things. I don't know if I had that much more. Okay, yeah, that's a whole different topic. So yeah, so it looks really promising for doing work in MS. There was also another poster at ECTRIMS where they were looking at whether GAD would still detect GAD enhancing lesions, and it does. So that's also encouraging that you can do that. Okay. Any other questions? I think we're running out of time. I'll just maybe quickly just show the last couple of slides. So another little project that we've been working on at UBC that Julian's also very aware of is building this imaging repository for names, which is the North America Imaging and MS Cooperative. And so the idea here is that all the centers within North America that do MS research can put their images in here, and then you can go in and apply to use other people's data, which ties in with the open science initiatives quite nicely. So we're definitely building this around sharing the Hyperfine data as well to try to accelerate being able to share this and develop all together as well. If you're interested in this, this will also include spinal cord data. So that's going to be, I think, quite an exciting initiative. Oh yeah, and then this was just a quick acknowledgement to the group and some of the work that we do, especially Adam's work accelerating myelin water imaging, and we'll hopefully be able to take some of the techniques that he's going to be presenting at ISMRM shortly in May to accelerate things and apply these to the low fields scanning as well. Maybe stop sharing there.
Thank you, Shannon and Sharada. It's really, really exciting to see that this live demo and all the results that you already get from the scanner and how the potential. And I really honey sometimes not only about the scanner, but what you do with it, when it's feasible to do it. So it probably needs to come with a more global solution if we want to push these kind of technologies into remote areas, developing countries, low-income countries, etc. So that leads us to the last part of our conference, which is kind of an open discussion. So we have different options to do that. We could just throw a bunch of large questions to panel members, and I would be happy to have other people answer as well, to have more like an open discussions more than us answering this question and just telling what we think about that. That would be helpful, I think, for us also to hear about what other people think about these questions, about other people think about what are the challenges in terms of accessibility in neuroimaging in general, but even if we look at the Hyperfine scanner, what are the challenges to bring this technology to a real accessibility matters, So the questions we set up at the beginning is high-tech really necessary to make neuroimaging more accessible? And maybe we could start, well, no, I'm just going to throw these questions like that. I forgot what I wanted to say just after that. So looking at high-tech, we can talk about high field, but well, maybe I'll start with you, Shannon. Do you think the low field MRI, low field MR fields is high tech, or is it kind of low tech?
No, I think it's very high tech. I think probably the reason that this is working, or at least so far that we've had such a good experience with it, is because of all of the innovations that have come before. And this is, I suspect, very much standing on the shoulders of giants of applying these things like the noise cancellations and the machine learning and all these tricks and making the sequences very efficient. So I would call that high tech.
Yeah, and one other thing that we've kind of informally chatted about a lot is that we think it's really going to push like the larger MRI manufacturers in terms of what they provide for value. When you compare the cost of the scanners and you see the images coming from our little fridge magnet, as we affectionately call it, it's it really brings up some interesting questions.
But it's certainly not, and they're not marketing it as replacing the higher field scanners. And there's still certain questions that you need higher fields to answer for sure. And for, big neuroscience questions, I think that's still important. You need to be able to get that resolution and, the high B value diffusion scans to map different pathways. And I don't know if fMRI will be possible with this, but I think it would be quite a challenge. So I don't think it does away with it, but in terms of just general care, I think this is got huge applications, and in particular, maybe not so much replacing MRI applications, but potentially replacing like head CT applications and ultrasound applications as well. But I think
why would we want to replace ultrasound?
Sorry?
Why would we want to replace ultrasound in this case? I mean, ultrasound is not that expensive.
I think, well,
portable.
yeah, well, I think it's better in a lot of cases. So like the images are more reproducible. And then of course, you only want to do so many head CTs probably in your lifetime as well. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of the logistic questions that Annie was bringing up earlier of how you actually implement this within the healthcare system, it's very interesting. Laura Barlow, our head tech, will be giving a talk that I'll be assisting with coming up for the Canadian Association of MR techs, to talk about this and see what the reception is amongst that community. Because it is quite amazing. Like you get such different reactions from different people, you know, where you get the stroke neurologists that are just like, yes, I need this. And, you know, the pediatric neurologists and that are just absolutely excited. And then you'll get other people that are like, why do we need this? We have tools already, we have pipelines, you know, we don't need more incidental findings. We don't need, you know, things that we can't follow up on. We don't want people using it irresponsibly, you know, because it is maybe too user friendly. So you might not go through the proper channels and that sort of thing. So it has been in some ways kind of polarizing as to the reaction to it.
Maybe accessibility. Oh, sorry, just really quickly.
Yeah, no, I was, go ahead.
Topic of accessibility. I may have missed this, but what are the energy requirements, or what's the sort of cost of running the scanner?
Yeah, that's really important actually, and I don't think we mentioned it. So it does just work off of a standard wall outlet on your typical 120 power, and it has a good size battery in it. So if you do have unstable power, like in a lot of these places, then it's still gonna be able to get through that, and it's certainly not catastrophic if you lose power the way it is with some of the bigger scanners. So you just really have to be able to get it there. Yeah.
Wow, thank you.
It uses the same amount of power as our coffee pot, and
yeah, I think it's 1100 watts when it's completely maxed out, but I think most of the time it's running well below that, so less than making a smoothie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were talking about you know, responsible use because it's quite easy to operate, but so it means it would be easy to train local health staff, you know, to use it properly, and then it's just a matter of getting the healthcare professional to read the images, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
then the follow-up.
Yes, that's I think the bigger question, yeah, is getting the proper assessment of the images and exactly following through on what's found. Yeah.
This might be a more kind of down the line kind of question, but I think of the sort of technical resources that many of our institutions need, you know, for image storage and management. And I wonder, what do you, so since a lot of the places that would be targeted for this initiative might not have those sorts of capabilities, how do you foresee managing data in that way for those groups?
Yeah, that's also really important. So Hyperfine has built in this cloud element to it. So they do offer, so you pay an annual contract that covers all the cloud storage and access to the data and that, so you don't have to have local storage. And obviously that has to be in line with all of the local regulations for privacy and that, but they meet all of the HIPAA compliance issues. So like I say, we're not using it yet in Canada because we'll need it to be stored and hosted here. But I think that that's already working in some of the other countries that we're working with, that they have that in place so that you don't have to have a local infrastructure to be able to store it. And so you just need the proper login credentials to be able to get in and access the images.
So I was trying to get an image of I'm not sure I have the right one. An image of a map of the MRI scanners around the world. And I guess they all in the North Hemisphere of the world, probably most of them, right? And I guess that would probably also this type of technologies, and we're talking about the Hyperfine, but there are probably other manufacturers that are developing kind of the same solutions, which brings MRI to lower cost with a value that is still interesting, and probably that will also change our community, right? You were talking, Stephanie, about diversity and inclusivity in our community and how people from low-income countries might not fit into the neuroimaging domain. Well, they might not have a scanner to start with. Well, that might change the way we include people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very inspiring watching that call I was mentioning yesterday with this Unity project with Gates and these centers that are, passionate about research but limited in resources. And so, trying to have people do these journeys. So there's one study out of India where they were studying myelination, or are still studying myelination, and having people do an all-day journey that is largely like by foot to come in and participate in this MRI scan with these kids, and then an all-day journey back to be able to participate in research, and then to be able to take this thing that you can bring to the communities and make an event out of it, and because it's also intimidating, right? Because you're taking people out of their environment that they're comfortable with in their community and taking them to this generally quite sterile, as you were saying, environments that can be quite intimidating and everything around that. So to be able to go and be part of the community, I think, is a big potential step forward to get people access to it that wouldn't normally want to.
Yeah, and I really love that you brought that point up, because we're also, I appreciated that earlier, Benjamin, you showed in your slides, we're seeing even structural differences between, and it's been known for a while that there would be structural differences between certain ethnic groups. And if you have a predominantly white population or a predominantly Western specific population, it might be difficult to ensure that your results generalize. And if we can move, these sorts of resources for research into other communities, that would be pretty important.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we talked only about the machines, right? Where do we go from there? I mean, improving accessibility in the neuroimaging community, lowering the field and lowering the cost of an MRI scanner is one thing. But you talk about initiatives for sharing data, making results more open. That's kind of the same thing. Not everybody has the access to these tools as well. So where do we go from improving the access from the MRI machines to actually making our results more accessible in terms of the society in general, but also for patients, but also for other researchers, That's kind of an open question. Like, if we want to make our results more accessible for patients, to include the patients into our results, again, is these AI technologies the way to go? Should we seek another path?
Yeah, as I see that question is high tech. Should we invest most of our attention into high tech means of, let's say, improving the physical methodology versus some, let's say, lower tech methods of improving things like data access? I think it is interesting that, if we talk about the data that exists, it is primarily generated from Western countries. And the questions that we ask are primarily come from a Western perspective. So I think there's at least some utility of having some new questions and data generated from, different countries. But yeah, I guess it's not a very specific question, but just a little bit of a push in that direction.